Voilà, chers téléspectatrices et spectateurs.
Well,
C'était un film extrêmement émouvant.
that was a very moving
Qui nous touche tous,
film, and I'm sure that we're all very touched by it.
La guerre fait rage en Ukraine.
The war has been raging for 3 years now in Ukraine, with hundreds of thousands of deaths and wounded, 6 million refugees, and terrible consequences as well for Europe. We've seen security issues, neutral countries now joining NATO, and a war that is really impacting Europe and indeed Africa as well, with this scarcity of wheat, which has sent prices rocketing there. Today, we're lucky enough to have a wonderful panel to discuss the underlying stakes here in the war in Ukraine and the possibility of moving forward. I'd like to invite Oleksandra Matviïtchuk, who is joining us live from Kiev. She is the Nobel Peace Prize winner 2022 with her Center for Civil Liberties, and she's the Vice Deputy President of the International Human Rights Center. And so, festival. So we are delighted to have her joining us here from Kiev. It's 1 hour later in Kiev. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd also like to invite to the stage two former ambassadors. Former French ambassador Pierre Lévy, who was recently ambassador in Russia from 2020 to 2024. He was also ambassador in various posts in Eastern Europe. He knows Eastern Europe very, very well. Please join us on the stage.
Et j'invite aussi sur le plateau Monsieur Martin
and Mr. Martin Sajdik, who was the ambassador of Austria in New York and China. He was also the special representative of the OSCE for Ukraine and the Minsk talks. Thank you very much. Round of applause, please. Thank you for joining us. So our debate will last about 45 minutes, and then there will be 15 minutes for Q&A with the audience. So let's start immediately.
To Oleksandra, and I would like to have your reaction to the film that we saw tonight. What did it? How did you react to it?
I think this film is a beautiful art metaphor to the current event. I mean, Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Because in this war, we are fighting for a freedom in all senses. For a freedom to be an independent country, but not Russian colony. For a freedom to preserve Ukrainian identity and not to be forced to re-educate Ukrainian children as Russians. And for a freedom to have our democratic choice, like a chance to build a country where the rights of everybody are protected, government is accountable, judiciary is independent, and police do not beat students who are peacefully demonstrating. And you see the same spirit in this film.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais peut-être une petite réaction de Monsieur l'ambassadeur, Pierre.
Just a reaction from Ambassador Pierre Lévy. How do you react to the film? It's true, it talks a lot about independence, freedom. How do you see it? Yes, all of those very strong political messages come through. It's wonderful when Natalia explains to her grandchild what she means, what she understands by sovereignty, independence in her domestic sphere, with the war kind of in the background. And what struck me was the aesthetics of the film. It's a very beautiful film. There's a real unique cinematographic style. Quite apart from the flowers, there's a lot of humor in the film as well. I think we all found it very amusing because obviously Natalia is a fascinating character. And there's a lot of symbolism. It's very interesting because Kitty, who ends up passing away, leaves for Warsaw, whereas the others stay and want to see it out to the end. So it's such a human, such a wonderful film. That's what I'm struck by.
What's your reaction to the movie?
Bon, premièrement, excusez que je ne vais pas répondre.
First of all, sorry for not answering in French.
Switch to English. For me, this film explains why we are now in the 4th year of war. It explains the strength of the average Ukrainian, the dedication of the average people to their nationhood, to their nation, to their identity. It might be very mixed. You have the husband has a Russian passport and goes to Warsaw, but they all have lived together. But what they wanted was to be on their own and to live their life. And this film tells us why Ukraine is still fighting, is still strong, contrary to all predictions.
Thank you so much merci beaucoup pour ces réactions.
Thank you for those reactions. Let's really get into the substance now and talk about the stakes here in this war, and is there a possibility of peace? As you'll have noticed recently, of course, a lot of things are changing. We've seen the Trump administration coming into power, which seems to be aligning more with Russia than with Ukraine.
Oleksandra, today there have been talks in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and between American delegation led by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Volodymyr Zelensky's advisor Yermak. I was wondering, what do you expect from talks like this? And do you fear capitulation? Because obviously that's what we're also talking about when we think about the Trump administration's pressure on President Zelensky.
Two things to comment. First, I'm a human rights lawyer and I'm documenting war crimes in this war which Russia has launched against Ukraine. And I know for sure that people in Ukraine want peace much more than anyone else. Because war is horrible. But peace doesn't come when country which was invaded stop fighting. That's not peace. That's Russian occupation. And Russian occupation is the same war, but just in another form. Because Russian occupation means enforced disappearances, torture, rapes, denial of your identity, forcible adoption of your own children, filtration camps, and mass graves. So we have to define the word peace properly. Ukrainians want peace, which means a freedom to live without fear of violence and to have a long-term perspective. And this is our goal. And second, recent weeks and recent days, we hear a lot about natural minerals, possible territorial concessions, interests, even about suits, but we don't hear about people. I'm really shocked how less we speak about people in this war. What will be with more than 20,000 Ukrainian children illegally deported to Russia, separated with their families and supposed to be adopted by Russians who will bring them up as Russian citizens? What will be with thousands and thousands illegally detained civilians, men and women, subjected to horrible torture and sexual abuse daily? What will be in people in occupation in general? They live in gray zone. They have no tools how to defend their rights, their freedom, their property, their lives, their children, and their beloved ones. And I'm sure that our moral obligation is to return human dimension to all political process around the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine.
Yeah. You're talking about the human dimension of peace, and I was wondering how you can expect that from Donald Trump, knowing that he's trying now to have an agreement on minerals, on, he wants to exploit the natural resources of Ukraine, even though the proposal at the beginning was Volodymyr Zelensky's proposal. But the way the Trump administration is dealing with that seems to be very far away from the human dimension you're talking about. What do you think about that?
It's not the first time in my life when I found myself in a situation when the international law doesn't work. And I know for sure when you can't rely on the international system of peace and security, you can still rely on people, because people have a much more impact than they can even imagine. And mass mobilization of ordinary people in different countries of the world can change the history quicker than even UN intervention. So my main message today to ordinary people in different countries: be our voice. Help us to spread this message out, that we must return human dimension into all political process.
Thank you. What would be actually, because when we're talking about peace or things like that, there's always a need for concessions on both sides. What would be a just peace for you? You already explained some of that before, but what would be the possible concessions that Ukraine could make, knowing that Russia would have to do also the same?
What concession have Russia to do, if I may ask? It's a rhetorical question, because in order to stop this war, Russia has to stop. That's all. Russia started this large-scale war, not because Putin wants to occupy just more part of Ukrainian land. Putin started this large-scale war because he wants to occupy and destroy the entire country and go further. He thinks about forcible restoration of Russian Empire. He dreams about his own legacy. His logic is historical. It's very naive to think that he see his name in the world history like person who started large-scale war in order to occupy Avdiivka or Bakhmut. I'm sorry, it's an important city for Ukrainians, but it's not Geneva, it's not Berlin, it's not Rome, it's Avdiivka and Bakhmut. Majority of Russians have no idea that they exist on the map before large-scale war started. Putin sees Ukraine like a bridge to Europe, because Russia is empire, and empire has a center, but has no borders. Empire always tries to expand. It means that if we want to build sustainable peace, we must design a security guarantees, which makes for Putin impossible to achieve his goal, not just to postpone it in time.
Merci. Monsieur l'ambassadeur.
Thank you. Turning to you, Ambassador. I'd like to get your view on this. You were ambassador in Moscow from 2020 to 2024, and on the 24th of February 2022, you were, when Russia invaded Ukraine, in Moscow. You were at the embassy there. What can you tell us about that very intense moment that you experienced there? And maybe tell us a little bit about Russia's objectives in this military disastrous adventure in Ukraine. If I could just start by with that last question, to follow up from that very strong series of comments that we've heard a moment ago about putting people at the center of this. And I think that's an interesting perspective that needs to be shined onto diplomacy, which tends to forget people in all of this sometimes. I think it's very, very important to understand that, of course, everyone wants peace. Ukrainians, Europeans, and Americans. But, people don't all see peace in the same way. I mean, peace doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, and we can talk about that in due course. The European approach is no decision on Ukraine without Ukraine being involved in that decision, and no decision on Ukraine without the Europeans being involved. And I think there's a difference between wanting a ceasefire and a real, sustainable and fair peace, and a quick fix, which would be just a very short-term solution, which might look like surrender. And then there's a peace, no peace without Russia. And I think this is something Moscow, Russia, feels like they're winning. And you'll have seen that over the past few months that we've just seen since the 12th of February, when we heard the first official communication between Presidents Putin and Trump, one single actor is not saying anything, and that is Moscow. And Moscow is actually winning without having to say anything. And so, unfortunately, on the 24th of February, that invasion wasn't really a surprise, because we've been working for a long time now in a very tense, we've been working in a very tense atmosphere for quite some time. In 2021, Russia was building troops up along the Ukrainian border, and that was already very worrying. And we rose that issue with the Russians, and they said, these are exercises on our territory, we're just moving troops around, and so on. And then tension started to build. And I remember meetings with the Russians in November in Paris that were extremely tense. And the French president came to Moscow to try everything he could. And then in the days prior to the invasion, we saw large numbers of refugees from Donbass and Donetsk. I thought that were organized by the Russians. And we saw the recognition of the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk, of course. And then, just the day before the invasion, quite late in the evening, the Kremlin spokesman said that there had been a request for assistance from those breakaway republics because of Ukrainian repression. And, of course, then we all know what happened next. And that reference to legitimate self-defense by the Russians is a permanent feature of the Russian discourse. They basically claim that they are the ones being suffering from aggression, from NATO. It's a reverse logic, and I think it's something that you really need to bear in mind. Unfortunately, some of the recent developments that we've seen, and in particular what was very difficult for me to see as a diplomat, the vote on the 24th of June at the UN, the 24th, where you saw the US voting with Russia and indeed a few other countries that I won't even mention. I thought that was very, very significant, unfortunately. What would you like to say? You talked about NATO. That's an argument that Russia often uses as one of the factors that they use to explain the Russian intervention. So for Russia, was NATO getting too close to Russia? Well, what I can say, in my contact with the Russians when I was discussing this idea, we had professional discussions with the Russian diplomats to try to find a solution. I said to them, look, we did exactly the opposite of what you are claiming we did. And by that I mean, we were not pushing closer to the east and to the Russian border. to try to put pressure on Russia. We're just seeing countries that became sovereign in 1991 or later and made free decisions to form alliances. That was one of the basic principles of Helsinki. And in certain cases we agreed, in others we didn't agree. We were not pushing closer to Russia. And you'll remember the discussion at the NATO summit in Bucharest, where there were discussions between Europeans and Americans on Ukraine. And there were a lot of discussions about Ukraine in the European Union. I was working for the European Union in 2014. At the time of Maidan and the change of power in Kiev. I was even in Kiev at that time with my minister, Laurent Fabius, and the German minister and the Polish minister, and there were a lot of discussions about Ukraine at that time in the European Union. But look where we are now. NATO has been strengthened, NATO has been enlarged, and in fact, European membership is now more open to Ukraine, and there are a lot of discussions taking place still about Ukraine even joining NATO. And that's exactly what the Russians didn't want to see. Thank you. Ambassador Martin, you were the special representative of the OSCE in Ukraine for the Minsk discussions and the Minsk agreements. Today, you work on the ceasefire, and it's something that we have been talking about. What kind of ceasefire? Even Zelensky is talking about a ceasefire, maybe an aerial ceasefire, naval ceasefire. What would you have to say about that?
I think ceasefire has been discussed also from Ukrainian side. Also, President Zelensky has been talking about this. And if we speak about ceasefires, we have to be very clear what we are talking about. We will have a length of a border, or this is not the right word actually to use, but a demarcation or the length of the line, what was previously the border between Russia and Ukraine has now changed. And we have a length of more than 2,500 kilometers. Where are we going along this line, along this buffer zone? Where are we going to have a ceasefire? All along? Will there be a ceasefire that will be a whole ceasefire, including all different types of arms, on the ground, in the air, aerial forces, naval forces, or will it be a partial one, as it was proposed previously by President Zelensky? And when shall it start? I remember in the Minsk agreements, on the 12th of February 2015, when the Minsk agreements were signed in the presence of Merkel and Hollande, it says that on the 15th of February, the ceasefire should come into effect. But this was 3 days after the Minsk agreements were signed. But there was no ceasefire. It was on the 15th of February. It was the fight for the city of Debaltsevo, which was controlled by Ukrainian forces, and the so-called separatists from the Donbass, Lugansk and Donetsk, supported obviously by Russia, chased the Ukrainian troops away, and Debaltsevo fell. So there was no ceasefire. And so we have to be very clear, what will we be talking about? When I was in charge of the negotiations in Minsk, we negotiated dozens of ceasefires. And sometimes they held for a week, sometimes for 2 days. And the last ceasefire that was actually negotiated then by my successor, the Swiss ambassador Heidi Grau, in July 2020, lasted actually for a couple of months. It was the time of COVID, and both sides did not want to have soldiers, wounded soldiers, more in the hospitals that were already overloaded with people having COVID. So there were different type of ceasefires. Then we have to discuss, do we want to have a demarcation? A demarcation will have political implications, like we have that, or we see it with the Korean example. Is that the will of the sides? We should understand very well, and let's not forget, Russia changed its constitution to incorporate 4 Ukrainian oblasts into Russian territory. Of these 4 oblasts, they control with about 95% only one, which is the oblast of Lugansk. The other 3 oblasts, they control only partially, and they nevertheless included them as Russian territory into their constitution. So if you have a demarcation, this would also mean that Russia would have to cede territory if you have the demarcation now. Are they ready for this? And there are also the question of verification. Who is to verify? Will we have a UN force on a line of demarcation of more than 2,500 kilometers? We would need at least, there are estimates of 100,000 troops, UN troops. Where do we get them from? So all these questions, if we talk about ceasefire, we have to be very sober in trying to answer them.
Ambassador, do you believe in the process that the American administration has launched, or is it not at all the format that might allow a decent peace process? What would be the ideal way forward in terms of format and things like that? You've been working for the OSCE. OSCE today is in crisis, but is there an ideal format for this kind of discussions?
To be honest, I don't know. And I don't see any kind of format that the Americans at the moment are proposing. And I personally have the opinion that the Americans themselves don't really know. And they change their mind one day after the other. So that's for sure. The question is more in this context, what us Europeans think should be done. Also there, we should get some answers. We don't only have to look to the Americans. So I don't believe that this is the right time to answer a question like that. And let's not forget, and this is for sure, as Ambassador Lévy had said, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, but also nothing about Europe without Europe.
Thank you. Oleksandra, I would like to have your take on what happened in the last weeks. I want to go back to the Oval Office where President Zelensky had a clash with the Trump administration that was very humiliating in a way. And I was wondering how you perceive the way President Zelensky has to navigate between tremendous American pressure and humiliation, as I said, and on the other hand, the fact that Ukraine cannot count on security guarantee from Europe yet, if they come someday. What's your general feeling about President Zelensky? Does he have support in Ukraine, and how do you see him moving forward?
According to social survey, President Zelensky has a high support in Ukraine. And probably it's not my task to discuss the emotional scene which we all saw in the White House. Also because I think that we have to switch our focus for something which really matters. We speak too much about suits. Let's stop to do it. Let's speak about something which is really important. And two things are how, together with Europe, we have to design security guarantees. Because borders of Russian Empire never ends, and this is not my quote, this is a quote of Vladimir Putin. I saw it in my human rights work. I interviewed hundreds of people who survived Russian captivity. They told me how they were beaten, raped, smashed into wooden boxes, their fingers were cut, their nails were torn away, they were electrically shocked through their genitalia. They also told how Russians see their future. They see the future like this. First, we'll occupy Ukraine, and then, together with you, we will go to conquer in other countries. And process of forcible mobilization of Ukrainians to Russian army, all these 11 years is going on in occupied territories. And second, let's speak about people. Just recently, I saw another documentary film devoted to my friend and colleague, Ukrainian journalist Victoria Roshina. She saw that her journalist obligation is to come to occupied territories and to show the world what's going on there. She disappeared. We have had no information about her whereabouts for months. Then we found her in Russian prison without any official charges. And in September last year, her parents got information that Victoria Roshina died in Russian prison. For 6 months, Russians didn't return her body. And we still have no idea what they did with her. This is important because if we, with all international architecture of peace and security, have no pressure to Russia just to return a body of 26-year-old Ukrainian journalist Victoria Roshina, who died in Russian prison, to her parents, may I ask what we can do at all?
Oleksandra, you were involved in 2014 at Maidan, and as to remind the public, in 2014 there was a protest Maidan, and very European like, and I was wondering now, you also fight for democratic reform in Ukraine. And how would you describe the spirit of the Ukrainians today in terms of their wish to join the European Union, to go the democratic way and things like that? What's the general spirit of your people?
During the Revolution of Dignity, I was coordinator of civil initiative Euromaidan SOS. We brought up several thousands of people across the country. We worked 24 hours per day to provide legal and other assistance to persecuted protesters. And every day, hundreds and hundreds of people who were beaten, arrested, tortured, and accused in fabricated criminal cases passed through our care. So we paid a high price just for a chance to start Euro-integration process. And for people in Ukraine, Euro-integration is not just entering and joining to some geopolitical structure. It's a value choice. And we are very sincere in our path, because this war started not in February 2022, but in February 2014, when authoritarian regime in Ukraine collapsed, and we got our chance to start this Euro-integration process. In order to stop us on this way, Russia invaded. Russia occupied Crimea, part of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and 3 years ago extended this war to the large-scale invasion. Because Putin is not afraid of NATO. Putin is afraid of the idea of freedom, which came closer to Russian border. And we're still fighting. We're still defending our democratic future. And I know that only readiness to fight for values determine society which has a future.
Merci beaucoup pour ces mots extrêmement forts.
Thank you for those very stirring words. Mr. Lévy, they were very strong words. What can you tell us now? There's something that is bothering me about this switch that the US has operated and got closer to Russia. It's something that we're all wondering about. It looks like the Americans are aligning themselves much closer with Russia than with Kiev. Just look at the Munich conference where you were present. Vice President J.D. Vance already gave some arguments for negotiations, saying, well, Ukraine can't join NATO, it can't get back the territory that it had before 2014. So tell us, what has happened? Why has the US turned towards Russia? And what is this link between Trump and Putin? Well, I might disappoint you, but I don't really understand it myself. To be honest, I'm finding it difficult to understand. But there are various explanations that I could suggest. At one point, we might have thought that it was this sort of strategy to confuse people. Being really unpredictable makes your adversary confused. And that could have been a strategy. But unfortunately, what we've seen since then, I spoke of the vote at the UN, but I also could have talked about what Trump said about Zelensky, which was more or less exactly what Moscow was saying. And that suggests that that's not really the strategy at all. Secondly, it could have been a sort of geostrategic approach. This is a hypothesis I'm sharing with you, that it could have been an attempt to separate Russia from China, but I don't believe that at all, to be honest. It could be, and this is my personal opinion, that they think that the world of the future has three separate spheres of influence, three hunting grounds, one led by the US, one led by Russia, and the other by China. So I don't know. This is just a hypothesis I'm sharing with you. It's something to think about. And then there's another way of looking at it, and that is, I've always been fascinated in this career that I've been pursuing now for over 40 years. There's that personal dimension, and the ambassador to my right knows this very well as well. Diplomacy is very much a difficult machine. You have the Quai d'Orsay, you have the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All of these ministries tend to work pretty well. They are smooth machines. They come out with these very in-depth analyses. We prepare for summits, meetings, with all of the files prepared for us. This is what you're going to be asked. This is what you want to say. This is what we're looking for in the meeting. You know, I've been doing this all my life. And I say that it generally works pretty well. But there's a personal dimension that tends to be overlooked. And that is that at the end of the day, you have one person, a head of state, a diplomat or a minister, who has their own qualities, faults. They may be seductive. Maybe he's had a bad night's sleep before the negotiations. Maybe he's worried about one of his kids. You might laugh about that, but these are all parameters that need to be taken into account. And I know this from experience. And there, you see today very well that you have President Trump with his personality, as you might call it. And you know that there are personal difficulties between him and President Zelensky. Hunter Biden, for instance, is something to think about. And we tend to personalize this war by Russia against Ukraine as well. I don't think we should do that too much. But President Putin has his view, and he has around him a circle of supporters who will support him to the end. And there's a personal dimension there as well, even though there are interests linked to the regime and to Russia itself, for reasons that we all know, the restoration of the empire, this nostalgia of bringing Ukraine back into the Russian imagination. I'm just talking here about the Russian view of things. Ukraine has a very special place in Russian history, in their view, but I don't want to get into that historical debate. The reality is you have a sovereign, independent country that should be able to make its own choices. That's the reality, whatever the past and whatever the history of its large neighbor. So I'll stop there on that very sensitive issue, and I hope I haven't disappointed you too much in my reply. Martin, you were the ambassador of Austria at OSCE. You talked earlier about Europe. What role do you think Europe is playing in this? Oleksandra spoke of this a moment ago. For Ukraine, we're not just talking about joining a geopolitical body. This is a question of values. What can Europe do? What must Europe do on Ukraine? And what kind of guarantees can it try to provide?
I think that's the crucial point. It's the term valeur, values. This is what we have to talk about. In our societies, in our European societies, as different as they may be, Switzerland is a very special country. Ours sometimes is too. France definitely is, in Germany. But we all have, basically, we work on the same values. And Ukraine now shares these values. And that is important. We are democratic countries. And we, with all our weaknesses and strengths. And Russia, at this juncture, is an authoritarian country. Previously, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, it was a more open country. And we had a good relationship with Russia in these days. But Russia changed, and the ambassador is the témoin for all these changes over the years. And so this is where we are. We have different systems, and our democratic system, with our simple existence, poses a threat to an authoritarian system. And the democratic, successful Ukraine, by its mere existence, without doing any hostile acts against Russia, poses a threat to Russia. And this is what it is. And we have to be aware of this. And we Europeans have to now understand that we are to defend our values. The more so when we are starting to have doubts what will be the development in the USA exactly in this respect. Will the US be the country of the free people, of democracy, or will it change? But Europe will be the same, and we will be keeping our values and together with Ukraine. And again, by our sheer existence, whether we like it or not, we pose a threat to an authoritarian society. We have to defend our values not only militarily, but politically, and especially also educate our children, educate the young generation, that they understand that they have to appreciate these values. It's not simple. Because of our openness, we have forces that undermine us. We have our movements that are not so much democratic. In one European country it's like this, in another European countries it's a little bit different, but basically we see this. So the more so, we have to defend our values, and this is what we share with Ukraine. And let me say one more point. When Russia speaks about solution for and what they aspire afterwards, Russia always speaks and uses the term of denazification of Ukraine. I mean, you have to we've heard also that Russians have called Zelensky a Nazi, which in itself is absolutely absurd with the background of Zelensky. But this is what it is. With the term of denazification, this is just the cover-up for trying to always influence Ukrainian politics. I say who is a Nazi and who is allowed to run the country or not. And this is a point that we should never forget when the Russians use this term, denazification. It is not only, it's not only not to have them in NATO or what else, but this is also to influence and to say who is allowed to rule this country in a way that pleases the authoritarian structures in Russia.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur l'ambassadeur, vous souhaitiez réagir?
Thank you, Ambassador. You wanted to come back on that. Yes, exactly. I wanted to talk about Europe and its role. And I wanted to say two things about it. Firstly, if you look at things in perspective, because I think that's very important, this war is still a tremor from the earthquake in 1991. Because if you look at the difference between the world today and the world in 1991, we haven't evolved enough. The US hasn't yet found a strong relationship with Russia or with China. Only in one place have these tectonic plates really rearranged, and that's Europe, because we have managed enlargement following the fall of the wall. We've seen a great deal of success there. I was in Czechoslovakia, I was in Poland, and we've seen so many changes in the past 10 years in that very short space of time. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. So I believe very strongly in the transforming power of changing these societies into democracies and economic growth as well. We see people in Ukraine now dying, demonstrating with the European flag, and that should make us think very carefully, because we tend, as Europeans, to grumble a little bit about the EU. We don't necessarily appreciate it always, but we should recognize that there are people in our countries working to try to undermine our democracies. That's true. But at the same time, we should see this, that we need to rise to the expectations of these candidate countries, including Ukraine. And I think it's a very strong message that we're seeing there that brings us face to face with history. Thank you very much indeed. So let's open up the discussion now to the public. Thank you very much. So do just raise your hand and ask a very brief question, because we want to get as many questions as possible. And the fact that we have these wonderful guests with us, in particular our wonderful guest in Kiev, who will reply to you. Yes. Go ahead.
Bonsoir.
Good evening. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Oleksandra, for your words and your very touching comments. Ambassador, I was wondering if you really believe that Ukraine will be able to say what it wants before other states think in its place. Because in history, you see very often that nations have been divided up by other powers against their will. Mr. Lévy, I think that was for you. Will Ukraine have its say in its own future? Well, yes, we need to work on that basis, because you need to recognize that we tend to forget reality in this discussion a little bit and overlook the reality. Think that things can be all decided in Washington or somewhere else. I just can't imagine even in the worst case scenario. Of course, there'll be very strong and maybe even tragic reactions in Ukraine, but also in other countries. I just don't believe that the world can be decided like that. And that's my intuition. Unlike what people say, I think we're at the beginning of a whole process now. We're not at the end of the process yet. I think we talk about the ceasefire. The Russians are being very demanding in that respect. But what do we mean by peace at the end of the day? That's what we need to think about. Quite apart from the European security architecture, which is, of course, a major issue as well. Another question? Yes.
Thank you. My question is to Oleksandra Matviïtchuk. It's a bit a naive question, but as well a really genuine one. We saw Natalia laughing under her tomatoes and alarms. You're still fighting despite these 3 years of war. I would like to ask, how do you do? How do you think that Natalia is doing in order to keep hope and to still be laughing, to still be fighting in this context? Because from Europe, I don't see things moving, I don't see things improving, and sometimes I wonder how you do.
Thank you very much for asking. It's very difficult to live during the large-scale war, frankly speaking, because it means that you live in total uncertainty. You can't plan not just your day, you can't plan your next several hours, you have no idea what will happen. You live in a constant fear for your beloved ones, because there is no safe place in Ukraine where you can hide from Russian rockets. And Russia deliberately hit residential buildings, schools, churches, museums, and hospitals in different regions of my country. So when we go to bed, we have no idea whether or not we will get up next morning, because war is a lottery, and probably it will be your residential building which will be hit by Russian missiles this night. But despite everything, I think it's important to define the word hope properly. When I was a child studying at school, I got acquaintance with Soviet dissidents, and suddenly I appeared in a circle of fantastic people, people who say what they think and do what they say, people who had bravery to stood up their voice against the entire totalitarian Soviet machine. The dissident movement were severely persecuted. People were killed, people were jailed, people were forced to psychological forcible treatment, but they didn't give up. And I still use this definition of hope from this dissident ethic. Hope, it's not a confidence that everything will be fine, but hope, it's a deep understanding that all our efforts have a huge meaning.
Thank you so much. Une autre question.
Another question.
Planning to speak, but when I heard Oleksandra, I had to speak about hope. I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Russia, and I wanted to say that 2 days ago, at the General Assembly of the United Nations, all countries in the world were voting for a new day, International Day, the Day of Hope. And guess which was the only country that voted against all others against this day? It was the United States. It was the United States. And 4 countries abstained. I think the film that we saw tonight taught us 2 things. Hope, what is hope, and what is freedom. And I think we have an obligation to the people of Ukraine to all the survivors of despicable violence and torture, the thousands of Ukrainian detainees in Russia who are still suffering, and the more than 2,000 Russian political prisoners from all walks of lives who stood up against this war and now are in prison in Russia under the same torturous conditions. And this obligation is to tell them, we know what peace is. Your Excellency, you are asking the rhetorical question what peace is. Peace is about peace, peace is about justice, and peace is about accountability. And we cannot allow one country, United States, to now start speaking the language and the narrative of the aggressor, and to say that Russia is not the aggressor, when we saw at 5 o'clock in the morning, on 24th of February 2022, what happened to Ukraine and to the peaceful life in Ukraine. So I think we need to pledge governments, United Nations, special rapporteurs, the whole architecture, as Oleksandra put it, of international justice, of international peace and security. We need to pledge our support that peace means justice and nothing else. And peace means people.
Thank you so much, Ms. Katsarova. I read your report on Russia, and I know you didn't get access to the country, and you did a wonderful job. I would like to maybe a reaction from you, Martin. You were UN head of ECOSOC and things like that. What does it say? What Ms. Katsarova was saying about this vote that took place at the General Assembly, where the US voted with Russia, Iran, and North Korea? Is that a turning point in the UN?
Well, sure, and that's we are in a situation, honestly, that we would have not predicted. Nobody ever would have predicted this as it developed. We had, all our reservations about another term of Trump, and we expected it to be, let's put it mildly, difficult. But it would have extents like we see now. I guess nobody would have expected. But if we turn to the UN and the UN system, and you mentioned that I was president of ECOSOC, that's the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations in 2014 and 2015, and these were the years when the SDGs were adopted, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And there is one goal among these Sustainable Development Goals that one should not forget, and that's Goal 16. That speaks about peaceful societies, good governance, and the rule of law. And I do believe that this is important always to remember, that we do have these common goals. The goals were adopted in the presence of Obama, Putin, Xi Jinping, the Pope, you name it. And Shakira was singing in the General Assembly, Imagine. So here we are. Okay, that might sound now very emotional, but these goals are here. These goals are reference points for all of us. And we should not forget to have a goal on good governance, like Goal 16, as part of a global development agenda, is a huge achievement, and we should always keep that in mind.
Merci. On a le temps pour une dernière question.
I think we have time for a last question. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm with FIDH, and I have a brief question. What lessons can the NATO and the EU draw from the war in terms of defense policy and deterrence? And a second, and if I may, if Russia is allowed, which we all hope not, to keep any occupied Ukrainian territory, what precedent does this set for international law and future conflicts, especially in Europe? Thank you.
vous en prie.
Well, we would like not to have these presidents. We Europeans, as the ambassador rightly said, what do we Europeans ask? We ask a very simple thing, that those post-Soviet countries that that decided to dissolve the Soviet Union in December 1991 with the Almaty agreements, where the then existing borders were recognized by all these states among each other, that these successor states of the Soviet Union stick to what they all have decided themselves. Nothing more, nothing less. And this is what we Europeans want. We don't want any other changes, simply that they keep, and Ambassador Lévy said it very clearly, that they stick to what they themselves have decided. Let me remind you of one, so to say, anecdote in this context. The Soviet Union was then dissolved by the speech of Gorbachev on the 25th of December 1991 at 10 o'clock in the morning in the Soviet Union in Moscow. At this time, it was still just Christmas Eve in the US. And as we know, the US then under Bush, the elder president, was not in favor of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Bush himself went to Kiev in order to fight not to have the Soviet Union fall apart. But it fell apart because also of the differences between Gorbachev, the personal difference, and Gorbachev and Yeltsin. But how did the Americans react? And this is something we should not forget. We Europeans should not forget, because the Americans, I'm sorry if there are Americans here, you might now think that this Austrian is extremely anti-American. But what did they have as a declaration? It came out as a reaction. The Bush the elder said the US has won the Cold War. So this was the reaction when they were sitting at the Christmas turkey, not knowing how to react, and they came up with this. For a democratization of a society, as the Soviet Union then was, they dissolved it in an orderly way, still in Almaty. The reaction is that we won the Cold War. If you have a winner, you have a loser, and all those who decided to split up the country in an ordinary way were stamped the losers. With this mind that has come from the transatlantic, we still to some extent live under this, so to say, heritage, because, and Putin has referred to this very often, no European has said that, and let's keep that in mind.
Merci beaucoup. Et pour conclure, j'aimerais donner
Thank you very much indeed. Just to conclude, I'd like to give the final word to Oleksandra. We're lucky enough to have her here with us in Kiev.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this event. I just remind that this war has not just military dimension, but also informational dimension. And it's a good occasion to highlight that FIDH sent a brilliant submission to International Criminal Court, described the work of Russian propagandists as a war crimes. This war has economic dimension and value dimension as well, because this is not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And with this war, Putin attempts to convince the entire world that democracy, freedom, human rights, rule of law are fake values because they couldn't protect you during the war. Putin attempts to convince that country with a strong military potential and nuclear weapon can break international order, can dictate its rules to entire international community, and even forcibly change internationally recognized borders. And if Putin succeeds, It will encourage other authoritarian leaders in different parts of the globe to do the same. And that is why people in Ukraine are fighting not just for ourselves. People in Ukraine are fighting to support international order, which is based on UN Charter and international law, which means that with all our efforts, we are preventing the global violence.
C'est sur ces mots très
Well, with those very powerful words,
pour les valeurs.
that brings this debate to an end. Ukraine is fighting for an international rules-based order. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the participants, Ambassador Pierre, Lévy, Martin, Sajdik. Thank you very much for talking about the enormous stakes here in this war that we hope will be over soon. Thank you very much.